So, day and night. Well, if you look outside, it's night. But what does that mean? This is a very unique chapter in that it talks a lot, or it brings to our attention our duality that we have in life. If you think about how we have life set up, we have positive, we have negative. We have male, we have female. We've got day, we've got night. We've got all of these, what we would term polar opposites. But when we're talking about it from a spiritual level, the day and night is pretty interesting. If you read Genesis, it said, God said, let there be light. So obviously he went over to the ONOFF switch, flipped it on, and everybody was illuminated, right? And that's kind of what it says in Genesis. But that's not what it really means. If you read the Cayce readings about how our soul paths have been, the let there be light was awareness that we who have lost our way have now seen the light and now have a light way back home. That's what it really means. We were just going down the wrong path for so long that we forgot where we have come from, and thus we, the forgotten, needed a method to realize that we were not forgotten. We did the forgetting, but we were never forgotten. So the light, the awareness is bringing it on into us. The duality in life is all around us because what we're really trying to achieve in a lot of ways is what's balance. We have a lot of balance that we need to achieve because it's very easy to go off kilter one way or the other. And what we've got to do is find the happy medium. Think about our beings as addicts. We can overindulge in food and beverage and behavior, etc. Cayce tells us that the moderation is okay. Things in moderation are okay. Moderation infers a balance. When we see about the day and night, we notice on earth we are essentially why do we have dark? Because we are in the shadows, perhaps? But again, what is it telling us? It's telling us that it may be dark right now, but what's going to happen soon? It's going to rotate back into light. It's not permanent. Our path has been really involved a lot in darkness. We're now coming out of the darkness. We still have tendencies to find ourselves back in darkness occasionally, but it's nowhere near as bad as it used to be. Consequently, we see a lot of things from history that talk about how this came out, because man likes to use words to describe what he thinks is godly actions. Thus, the night of the soul. Is it really the soul really in the nighttime, or is it just a transitory phase? Well, we'll find out. So, without any further ado, to talk to you about the shadows and the shadows of night and things that go bump in the night, it's Mr. John Schroeder.
Hey.
And the crowd goes wild.
Thank you, Steve. I was looking at that introduction and looking at the slide here, or picture off to the right. Don't let your struggle become your identity. I remember many years ago, it was probably in the middle 80s. Many of you have heard of the Logo Center in Herb and Amperier. It was the first time that I visited the place. And they had a rather wealthy benefactor at that time who actually owned the property where they were at 64th Street in Thunderbird. And she was a beautiful lady, really had a nice personality. And then later I found out in that same meeting that she had a disorder that is called lupus. And it's a blood disorder much like leukemia, but not quite as deadly in that case. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, what a shame, that she has this kind of a challenge in her life. And I remember she got in this beautiful big sedan, a big Mercedes, and she goes driving off, and on her license plate it said lupus. And I looked at that and I went right back to this, that her struggle had become her identity. It was as if she saw herself as, I am this person with lupus, instead of I am a child of God who happens to have a challenge in front of me that I thoroughly intend to overcome. As we always do, we need to put a disclaimer in the front of this so that you know that you are getting the Edgar Cayce readings according to the Gospel of John Schroeder. So I have taken a look at all the Edgar Cayce readings, which I am glad to turn those over to you by email. I'll give you my email address at the end of this to be able to just send you not only the PowerPoint presentation, but the actual readings that I used in order to be able to put this together. So it's certainly subject to my interpretation of the thing, and I invite any and all questions in order to be able to do that. You know, one thing I need to say, you've seen us videotaping this for several months now, and we had to get the bugs worked out of the system, but now we have, 6 videos that are on the edgarcayceaz.org website. Do you know that all of a sudden that thing took off and we are getting over 10,000 hits a month to watch these presentations? So when we have a few dozen people that are in here live watching this, we have 10,000 across the world that are watching it, because I was just looking at some analytics, and we've come from Great Britain, Belgium, Malaysia, Australia. I mean, it's all over the place. So whenever you have, the power of Google and the internet and YouTube is an amazing thing. So you'll be seeing us tweaking some more to be able to accommodate our, hello everybody at home. All right. One of the things that I have been advertising for this talk is in the dark night of the soul. And we've all heard that quote. It's not biblical, by the way. You know that there is no biblical quote that talks about the dark night of the soul. Though I make my bed in hell, thou art there. Though lots of quotes like that. But it actually came from a book around, I think it was the 16th century or something like that. And this is the entire phrase. In the dark night of the soul, bright flows the river of God. Isn't it interesting that we dropped the second half of that? When it goes 500 years later, the second half of that disappeared, that bright flows the river of God. So it was from a poem, and we hung on to the first part, but somehow the second half of that sentence survived didn't survive when the first half did. And I'd like to say that this statement is half empty instead of completely full by cutting half of it off like that. The whole point of the talk this evening is to be able, from a Cayce readings perspective, to show that when we have the light and the darkness, that there is a positive way to see both of those things. That the darkness does not necessarily talk about evil, being alone, not having any help, no support. Seems like the world is against you. It's not like that at all, and we're going to go ahead and explore that much more deeply as we go. So, moving through and beyond a dark night of the soul is really what this talk is about. I'm going to start with a story that probably most of you have never heard before. I know after a while you hear me talk for years and years, and you tend to catch up with all of them, but I'm not sure I've ever talked about this one publicly. Because when you have heard me say that myself personally, I've never really experienced a dark night of the soul being raised in a Cayce family. Now, that's not a brag or, an outrageous claim. It's because when you're raised to believe in a God of unconditional love, and that all of us are His unconditionally loved children, and that the universe is friendly, and that the deck is stacked in each one of our favor, how do you wind up having a dark night of the soul regardless of what happens to you? I mean, it was a blessing to me to have been raised with those thoughts in mind. My mother and father weren't so lucky. So let's talk about a dark night of the soul in terms of what happens with the Schroeders that didn't get raised in the same way that their son did. Most of you know the story of how my mother got involved in the ARE, but I'll recap it briefly. She was born in 1924, in the right in time for the Great Depression to hit, as she came of age and started being able to understand things. And it was really tough. She was in Brooklyn, New York at the time. And her parents quickly divorced after that because they couldn't pay the bills. And in fact, Dad was a merchant marine who ran off to the ocean, and the mother went to work for a company called Bailey, Banks and Biddle, which were good enough to go ahead and put her up in a boarding house, but they don't allow children. So my mother got passed around from relative to relative, and in Catholic boarding schools and things like that for her upbringing. Unfortunately, the nuns would tell her things like, if you'll be a good girl, your parents will come see you. There wasn't a chance they were going to come see her, and so she's thinking, I must not be good. They never come see me. So that was the kind of upbringing that happened. Years later, after the Great Depression had eased and World War II was over, and my grandfather, her father, was doing much better, he was able to afford to send her, and he told her, you can go to any college you want, and I'll foot the bill. And she wanted to go to the University of Texas. She thought she was going to learn how to ride horses out in that state. Of course, she was in Dallas, so not as many horses there even back then. And that was where she met my dad. And they courted for a few years, got married in 1951, and the day after they got married, they were on their way up to Lake Louise in Canada. That was where they were going to have their honeymoon. And on a two-lane highway, my father tries to pass a slow-moving truck and just finds a car on the other side when he pulls out into traffic and avoids it by going into a ditch. Long story short, my mother gets out of the car, he is still inside, and the gas tank erupts, and it burns 70% of her body. This is the day after she got married. She goes through a tremendous rehabilitation time. In fact, I don't think I've ever mentioned this. She actually got hooked on heroin. It wasn't like she was the kind going down to Van Buren Boulevard to score a hit, but she was hooked on it so that she actually, after going through all that, had to be able to wean herself off of the drug in order to get back to a normal way of life. In the meantime, go forward a year, and my brother Bill, oldest brother of the family, is born. And a year after that, my sister Jan was born. Within a couple of months after Jan was born, my mother goes in to pick her up, and she has a blood clot to the brain. My mother didn't know it. She was just non-responsive. Take my sister down to the hospital, and they let us know that, well, not me, I wasn't even there yet, but let my parents know that she would never come to consciousness again. She was going to be in a vegetative state for the rest of her life. She actually lived to be 7. She wasn't even 6 months at this point, lived to be 7, and when she died she wasn't any bigger than this because her muscles never got exercised at that point. So she was just a little tiny thing. And now you're talking about a woman who was raised Catholic, always believed in a loving God, went through all of this stuff in the day after her wedding to get in a tremendous fire like that, and then to have her daughter taken from her even though she was still alive. It was just barely. Bottom line, they didn't know what to do. She really wanted to care for her, but they said, you need to put her in the care of the professionals. You just can't imagine how difficult it would be to take care of this child and try to raise a kid, and you still want more. And so my parents agreed, put her in 24/7 professional care, and I come along a little bit later. Well, this went on for a number of years. In fact, I was about 4 years old when my father got a job offer. We were all in Texas, got a job offer to go to California. And that brought up the question again of, okay, now do we bring Jan home to be able to care for her or not? And they had decided, they looked at it and they go, all things considered, it's only going to be rougher on you now that you have a new son to be able to take care of as well as the other one. If we decided she was going to stay in professional care before, guess what? We probably ought to stay with that decision, much as we hate it. And so that was the choice. They were going to put her in professional care out in California and transfer her over there. My mother had a dream that night, and she was reading a book. And she didn't remember what the text was of the book, but up in the corner was the page number. And oddly enough, on that number, it wasn't just a page like 50. It was a page number like a reading number. Like if you were to have a reading up here, the Search for God 262-31, something like that, she could tell that it was an Edgar Cayce reading number. And she was able to remember that even though she couldn't remember what she was reading. Well, my mother had been to ARE headquarters in Virginia Beach by then and become very good friends with Gladys Davis Turner. If you've heard that name, she was the secretary, the scribe, if you will, for all of the Cayce readings from the early 20s on. And Gladys was used to my mother calling up saying, gee, can I get copies of these readings? And so she just took the number down and said, yeah, I'll get back to you. Called her later on and said, where in the world did you get that number? And said, well, I got it in a dream. And she goes, well, you need to pay very close attention to what that reading has to tell you. She goes, the reason being is it's one of the readings where the person literally was in front of Cayce at the time when he gave it, and I never transcribed it from my shorthand notes. So that number's never been published, and no one's ever read the transcript of it because it's still in shorthand, my shorthand. And so you really need, I'll transcribe it for you, send out a copy, and we'll see what happens. So my mother gets the reading, and it's actually from people who have a child in a comatose state who are asking similar questions, saying, should we care for the child at home? And the answer to the reading was, this is not to be told to you one way or another. It is your choice to make. But rest assured, if the child is cared for at home, that it will receive the love and attention that it could never get if it's in professional care. So my parents decided right then and there, we're going to bring her home. I don't care how big a problem it is. We're going to make this work. And within a couple of weeks of that choice, before they ever brought her to the house, she died. Now you understand. The point of this is that Jan was hanging on all that time for my parents to understand we have a connection whether we come to consciousness or not. So even though she was in a comatose state, all that love, affection, and all the feelings that you have, all the care and service that you would like to be able to provide is definitely transmitted, not just by your actions, but by your thoughts as well. And once they got that lesson clear, and it was so clear because they were going to bring her home and take on that burden for themselves, obviously they believed it, and that was when the whole thing was released and Jan was able to go on. So she came in, put herself in harm's way, if you want to put it in those terms, and said, I'm going to do this so that you have the opportunity to learn a really tough lesson. Now, you understand how my parents got into and my father was kind of along for the ride on this, but he went willingly. So they definitely had understood the Cayce readings, believed in them, and they had had such a tough early years together in doing all this. Flash forward, I want to say 10 years, well, from there, probably about 7 or 8 years into the future. And my father, without this is the part you haven't heard. My father goes into the living room one day, sits in the big chair that was his. Don't sit in that chair, John. And he has a past life recall while he's sitting there. My mother wasn't around. He was just in the living room himself. And he has a past life recall of when the two of them were together. He was some kind of a magistrate back in the area of Winston-Salem in the 1600s. Does that sound familiar to anybody? As far as what was going on, the witch trials and all of that. My mother, as she was in the 1960s and earlier, was into things that were more metaphysical back at that time, which might have been considered witchcraft. And in fact, she was arrested and brought up on charges of witchcraft, even though she was engaged to my father at the time, in that lifetime back in the 1600s. And my father just kind of shied away, going, ooh, I don't want to have anything to do with that, and they burned her at the stake. You're starting to see how this pattern comes up again. My mother obviously didn't deal with that situation very well, thinking, you abandoned me, we're in love, we're going to get married. You need to stand, you're a magistrate, you're a person of standing in this town, get up here and tell them I'm not a witch, because I'm not a witch, I believe in God, I believe in Jesus, and all of this. He didn't, he just shied away. Now my father, so she brings forward, not that she needed to burn again, but she hadn't learned the lesson to begin with. So you just carry that whole situation forward, and she had to experience it again, where she winds up being tremendously burned. This time she survives it, through no fault of her own. It was his fault that the accident had taken place. And so she's got to get over to have true, unconditionally loving forgiveness for somebody else's mistake. And my father's part of it, he's having, look what I have done in this whole thing, and he has to be able to get through that and to forgive himself. So this is a really, really dark night of the soul for Helen Ruth and Fred Schroeder during that period of time, which I can say that my mother, without question, was able to get through that entire thing, able to release it and see it for what it was. Not a dark night of the soul, but the opportunity to be able to learn a really tough lesson. I don't know that my father did that much better with it in terms of being able to forgive himself out of the whole thing, but he made great strides in that lifetime to be able to get around it. So these, again, for those of us at home who haven't necessarily seen a lot of this is what a reading number looks like. The 262 indicates that it comes from the Search for God readings. The -55 means it's the 55th reading in that series. And then we have 10-133 being the date that the reading was actually given. We're going to start out here with kind of a definition of what day and night is all about according to the readings. The number 9 there means the 9th paragraph of that particular reading. So we find that light and darkness, day and night, are represented by that term as periods of growth and the periods of rest or recuperation. Notice it doesn't say anything about the dark night of the soul. This is talking about the light when you're sitting there surrounded by God and goodness and love, and it talks about the other periods where there's darkness, if you want to call it that, as periods of growth. All right? We're not talking about suffering. We're saying that this is an opportunity to grow, and periods of rest or recuperation. It's also, our auras. I don't know if you've ever talked to people that can see auras, but our auras pull back when we go into sleep. It's not that there aren't colors around us, but we can, if we're alive, for instance, I probably have a larger auric pattern when I'm standing here talking in front of the group than if I was just over there talking to my wife. So that you wind up saying, this is where it is normally, and then there are times when you really infuse with energy, and if you're asleep, then the auric pattern pulls back. Very much the same thing in terms of how much light comes out. So there are ebbs and flows in life, so where you're able to go out there, and when things are moving great, you just take advantage of it and move right out there and do it. But there are times when you, for instance, I was mentioning my father. He checked out very early in life. He was almost 65 when he died of congestive heart failure. And that, I can tell you that oftentimes we wind up passing of natural causes, if you want to call it that, when there is really no more soul growth to be able to gain within that particular lifetime. So you're going, I've gone as far as I can, and that it's better for me to reincarnate to be able to have new opportunities to be able to grow from. Now, another example that I think is really good in terms of rest or recuperation, because we constantly think of karma as just going to sit there and bash us over the head until we learn a lesson. The one that occurred to me for this is Stephanie's sister, my sister-in-law. Her name is Yvonne. And Yvonne had a really, really tough time. In fact, she got pregnant at 15. And, and she had the baby, and then she had two awful marriages after that, in which there was abuse, both mental and physical. And so she was constantly having trouble with men abandoning her or treating her poorly. And then all of a sudden, she runs into this guy named Mark. Now, the interesting thing about it is that if you were to see she and Mark together, they get along fine. It's not like any wonderful, incredible fit comes together with them. They get along okay. And I think what it is that she got to a point where she said, enough. I'm not going to get through it this life. There are other lessons to learn, and I really need to have this companion which isn't going to test me like the others, and yet I'm not going to have the soul growth that would be available to me if I were able to get on with it, so to speak. So I think that we can get up to a point where we go, okay, I just can't deal with it. Mark, come on, let's go ahead. We'll hook up at this point and have a reasonably happy life together from that point on, just because I need a break and it's not time for me to check out. These are things that happen, that I don't think often get mentioned when we talk about reincarnation or karmic patterns. So it would be a period of rest or recuperation for her, even though she's still actively learning lessons on the earth and other aspects of her life, whether it be with career or children and friends and volunteering or what have you. So from Joseph Campbell, you probably know him or have heard his name, he's an author and a pretty well-known Christian mythologist and things like that. The dark night of the soul comes just before revelation. When everything is lost and all seems darkness, then comes the new life and all that is needed. You've heard that statement that it's always darkest before the dawn. Now, logically, that makes no sense, but because it should just be an even transition to get into the daylight. But I think this makes sense from the idea of the story of Job. What's really, if you're familiar with the story of Job, the guy, the God and Satan had this kind of contest to see if his most faithful would be able to remain faithful even if you took all the good stuff away from him. And Job did persevere and got everything back and more that he had from before. Interestingly enough, that book of Job was written by Melchizedek. Now that's another book in the Bible, but Melchizedek, a character in the Bible, and you wind up having Melchizedek be one of the past lives that Edgar Cayce gave for Jesus. He had 30 past lives in the earth, and one of them was as Melchizedek. So here we are saying from the master himself, he wasn't quite the master at that point, but in the lifetime as Melchizedek, he was the one that wrote the story of Job as being the metaphor, the Aesop fable, if you will, as far as the trying to get the point across to us. But it really shows how you can eventually prosper through the worst of times, no matter how dark the darkest night that we experience, as long as we have a consistent faith in God. So if you haven't read the book of Job, it's really an interesting one to go through to see everything that was thrown at him and how he dealt with it. When I have the brackets there, the question or the topic at hand before we get into the quote on paragraph 17 here is trying to define day and night. So we pick up with it, the awareness of that which would make of thee a channel of blessings to many. And then there may be seen in soul's experience the meaning of what is day and what is night. The ability to become aware, or, to put into other words, to become conscious, is day and night. Now, this is one reason why we do Edgar Cayce-ons, because if you're not used to his syntax on there and you read that, you go, uh-huh. Just what in the world did that mean? But really what I think when you become conscious of what is day and what is night so that you can define them, so instead of defining darkness as a separation from God, what we begin to see as passing shadows is kind of the term, in fact, that comes up in another reading I'll be talking about later. So the shadows that come through in our life, we begin to see them for what they are. Those truly, anytime we start to have negative things happen to us in our lives, they're opportunities to learn obedience and to glorify God as we serve others through the example we set when we're challenged in what we profess to believe. Excuse me. So that you wind up saying, I believe this, and then all of a sudden you get challenged. And you say, I'm a patient person. Well, guess what? Life may test you on that if if indeed you need to do that. Most of you have heard me, if you've been in the study group with us, have heard me talk about this story of Susan, who had been in the study group with both my wife and I for a couple of years and was regular attendee, and she was really good at participation, seemed to know all of the Cayce stuff after a couple of years, and then she came in totally distraught one day. She could not stop crying because her husband of many years had come home and told her, I'm leaving you, and your 3 teenage daughters, our 3 teenage daughters, they're yours, and I'm going to take off with this young 20-something honey, and by the way, I lost my job, so I don't have any money to come after. So that was what she was dealing with when she came in, and of course she's distraught, and we're doing everything we can to be supportive, but we start reminding her of all of the things that we've been studying, the Cayce material, the 2 years she's been with us. And I will tone this down for you and for our audience at home, but her answer she finally just got all fed up and she goes, oh, well, let's forget all that crap. This is reality. So when you remember what I'm talking about when we're saying we're conscious of what is day and night, she was conscious of what was night. She could not remain conscious or be able to get her arms or mind around the idea that this is an opportunity to be able to be of service to all of the people involved. She had 3 teenage daughters to deal with. And I can tell you, by the way, to finish that story, she pulled herself up by her bootstraps. She put herself through school, got a master's degree, became a social worker with Orange County, and never again was able to trust a man to have a good relationship with him. But she put her life together financially, so that she was able to feel secure like that, but never had the level of happiness that she would really have wanted more than anything else. Next reading. To become aware is also to gain. So this becoming aware or conscious of day and night is also to gain, to go forward. For those that have lost their way Even as the master gave with the 99, remember the parable of the 99 and one sheep? Even as the master gave with the 90 and 9, all might be left to seek one. And the joyousness in finding, not in the loss, should be expressed. So in other words, this reading is saying, you know, you're talking about there's 100 sheep. One of them goes away, and the shepherd goes after the one, leaving the other 99. Said his priority was to go find and get that one back into the fold again. And guess what? He isn't going up into the mountains looking for the sheep going, that's so-and-so, just talking under his breath. He's going up there and has joyousness in the finding of that one sheep and bringing them back in. This is really an important concept because we always feel like, oh, I am really being a burden to God. I am being the black sheep of the one black sheep of the family that has gone astray. And how do we deal with that? The message is always the same from the Edgar Cayce readings. We can choose the light or the darkness because we have the free will to do so. Oddly enough, God rejoices in bringing home even the one soul that goes astray. So the idea is, do we focus on being lost, or how great it is that we're on our way back home to his God's loving arms? When you think about how do we make that up to God, one of the things that always comes to mind for me is his name Bill Wilson or Bob Wilson? I know one of them's Bill and one of them's Bob. Bill Wilson. You know, there were a couple of people, and his wife as well, who were the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA. What better program is there than to take the people who have been where the alcoholics are, who are alcoholics themselves and have pulled themselves up and been able to figure out how to function in this world with joy in their hearts and gone forward without alcohol at all. So the AA Mentor Program is an incredible way to be able to, it's almost a microcosm of what it is that we should all be doing for ourselves. As we're able to go ahead and grow spiritually, why don't we reach out to others and try to help the folks to overcome the things that we ourselves that we're challenged with and figured it out? You know, anytime I talk about that, I go, well, yeah, but, you know, you're helping a number of people in AA. What do you do with an Adolf Hitler? You take Adolf Hitler and you're going, he would have to live millions of lifetimes and and be able to affect all of those people to make up for what he just did in the one life. And I'll just give you an example of exactly what you could do in order to be able to deal with the kind of karma that Hitler put together for himself. How about that he has the opportunity, after he's learned his lesson, to come back in with the same opportunities to make a difference that Mohandas Gandhi did? Mohandas Gandhi, go over there in India, they were getting ready to have one heck of a war with Great Britain, even between the Muslims and the Hindus, to be able to free that nation. And yet he came in, and by the example that he set, by the gospel, if you will, even though he was Hindu, but the gospel that he was teaching allowed them to be able to become a free nation without much loss of life. Probably 6 million lives easily. When what would have happened had there been bloodshed with Great Britain at that time. So it was a really, really tough time. And imagine if that would have been Adolf Hitler who had come into that lifetime as Mohandas Gandhi, how much karma you could actually deal with and work off under a circumstance like that. So if you're thinking somebody like him or Joseph Stalin, who had 20 million people on his debit credit sheet, if you want to call it that, how do they ever overcome it? You are given the opportunity to be able to make a difference in that way. The dark night of the soul is where we learn who we are without people telling us. You know, you go through something really tough and, others may witness it or they may not, but that is when you get to say, hey, I actually know who I am because now I've been tested, and when push came to shove, I can tell you, remember Susan, when she came and said, hey, my husband's leaving me, he doesn't have a job, we still have 3 teenagers, how am I going to deal with this? Let's forget all that crap, this is reality. She told herself who she was in that case, no matter what we thought. And all we had was an outpouring of compassion for her because she was definitely going through a tough time. But this was when she was tested and she goes, I must not really believe all that stuff because I didn't take action on it. Well, one of the things that surprised me, because most people don't ever tell you how they experience, who you are and the example you set, until I married her. And Stephanie and I had been together about 8 months when my father passed away. And what was interesting, we weren't even married at that point. We were just engaged at that time. And so Stephanie's with me when my father passes away, and I immediately go home. She's with me. We go over to my mom's house. And he died in his sleep in bed. I mean, it's probably one of the best ways you can go, right? So there was that, and my brother comes in, so you have the entire remainder of the Schroeder family all sitting there trying to deal with the fact that, and that was, like I said, he wasn't even 65 yet. I was about 26. So, it was way too early for him to go at that time. And then you have to take a look at what did we look like to her? Because she was not yet, a total Cayceite. I mean, she'd heard about Edgar Cayce, and we talk about it all the time, but she hadn't been raised in it like my brother and I had, and of course my mother had been steeped in it for all those many years as well. And she got to watch what it looked like to have a family that absolutely believed this stuff. This isn't forget all that crap, this is reality, and my father's gone and all that. It was, you could see the sadness. You could see that there were tears, and you could also see us talking in terms of what the Cayce reading said is really what we believe. It isn't just, well, he's in a better place now. We started thinking, well, I wonder if blah, blah, blah. And we start theorizing of what he would be going through right then if it is according to what's given in the Cayce material. So somebody from the outside is able to look at us and say, you know what, it doesn't stop you from being sad. It doesn't mean that there isn't some darkness involved in there, but at the dark night of the soul, as an event like that would have been, we indeed did prove that this is what we believe. This is who we were, who we are. And it keeps you from being afraid of death at all. In fact, the creakier I get as I get older, I'm pretty sure I'm going to want to get rid of this body someday if it keeps going at the rate it is. So you want to make sure you're taking care of that. All right, next reading. What has been given as the truest of all that has ever been written in Scripture? God does not will that any soul should perish, but man, in his headstrongness, hearkens oft to that which would separate him from his Maker. So there's, in this, what is it saying? There is nothing truer that was written in Scripture than God is unwilling that any soul should perish. To me, that is really uplifting. That is really supportive. That is very encouraging. If you can get a source like Cayce to make it clear that there is nothing more true than God doesn't want any of us to perish, and frankly, if you're omniscient and omnipotent, how in the world does any soul perish if you've got that going for you? So I think there is an awful lot of encouragement just in that statement as it is to be able to say, we're going to make it. There isn't any doubt about that. Now, the interesting thing when you go on further, and it says, that we oft hearken to that which would separate us from him, from God, and you go, oh, how does that happen? And to me, this is something that I don't think it's discussed enough. And I think it's really an important thing that comes up in The Secret, in the law of attraction. I am very much a proponent of the law of attraction and to not think negatively. But one thing that has always bothered me about that is, do you never discuss anything that winds up being a negative in life? And the answer to that is, how could you go through life without dealing with the things that are potentially a problem? In the Bible, it talks about that we are to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. You've certainly heard that statement before. So the wise as serpents means, we understand the ways of the world. We just choose not to participate in them, but we know how to be able to react properly to them. To be angry and sin not is another way that the readings put that. So that we can go out there and say, we understand what goes on here and we know how to avoid it, but we're not going to condemn anybody for the way they are. So we can have the best of intentions and still wind up getting separated from our Maker. I think probably one of the greatest temptations that we have is trying to coerce others into doing things our way or doing things the way we think are best. And it's really, but I have this total understanding of how things could work. And guess what? According to the Cayce readings, that's exactly what happened with Jesus. Jesus was called on with a whole lot of souls. And the Cayce reading says he was hanging out in Arcturus. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's a star system somewhere, some many light years from here, and said, there's a planet over here called Earth. There are a lot of souls that are stuck over there and can't get out, and they need help. And there's Cayce and his group, Jesus as the soul Emilius. In Arcturus, it says, okay, I will go. And all of the people went with him, the souls went with him, to try to be able to save the souls that were entrapped on the earth. Now, here's the problem. Once you come down here and you have this perfect consciousness and you go, it's so easy, all you have to do is this. Well, you need to do this. I'm telling you, you have to do it this way. And the next thing you know, you're starting to get tighter and tighter as far as how you would want to be able to legislate morality at that point. So I may be taking some poetic license there with the readings, but it seems pretty clear that Jesus fell. Now, it isn't that there aren't the appetites of the flesh that you can get caught up in as well, but I think the first thing that takes us is the best of intentions, where we're out there going, but I can see all you need to do is this, and then you start turning it into, I'm going to make you do it that way. And as soon as you go there, now you've gone down the slippery slope, and then you open yourself up with a lower consciousness to the temptations of the appetites of the flesh. And that really is a difficult thing to get around. Cayce said that it took Jesus, or the soul Emilius, 30 lifetimes, the 30th lifetime being Jesus who became the Christ, is where it's described, saying that up until then, you know, he was learning all of his lessons, but that was the one lifetime in which he came in perfect and lived a perfect life without sin the entire length of it. Came in through the birth canal and exited by death, just like all the rest of us, and then showed us that in doing, you overcome death itself. Now, if you think, and I talked about in the very opening of this thing, the Logos Center and Dr. Herb Puryear. He was a clinical psychologist that worked with J.B. Rhine. Is that a name you remember, J.B. Rhine, the one that invented the Rhine cards for ESP experiments? You have wavy lines and boxes and triangle, circle, and so on. And so you're testing your ESP with that. Well, he worked with him, and they were testing people that were coming in to do their experiments. And one of the things in being able to qualify people was a test that asked, have you ever committed the unpardonable sin? Have you ever committed the unpardonable sin? He said that over 30% of the people answered yes. Think about that a moment. How do you approach the rest of your life if you think that you're absolutely doomed from that point forward because you've done something that God couldn't possibly forgive you for? Can you do anything with brightness, with joy, with love in your heart when you've got this dark cloud hanging over the back of you like that? And by the way, that's 30% being that people that answered it honestly. How many more do you think probably feel like they might have committed the unpardonable sin and just didn't mark it down on the survey? All right? So this is really an important thing to try to figure out, what is it that we have done in the past that we can't forgive ourselves for? God certainly forgives us, doesn't condemn us, but what do we do with that? And again, I'll go back to a story that can't, if you've seen the movie with Ben Kingsley of Gandhi, The Life Story, this comes right out of there, but it was a truism from his own life. It was when he was going through that fast, it went over 30 days, in which Great Britain had gotten the heck out of Dodge. They weren't the problem anymore. Now the problem was, were the Muslims and the Hindus going to be able to work their differences out without killing each other? And in fact, there were little skirmishes that were popping up all over the place. And Gandhi said, I am on a fast until you quit all violence 100%. I can't deal with this skirmish stuff. And I'll probably waste away and die here, but this point needs to be made. And then finally, they got the Muslims and the Hindus, and all the fighting had ceased for a couple of days at that point, and they came up in front of Gandhi to be able to show him, we are not fighting anymore. And then Gandhi was like, I'm not so sure I'm convinced. Well, one of the Muslims went up to him and he says, you start eating, you start drinking, you SOB. He goes, I am condemned to hell no matter what goes on here, but I really want to see this, peaceful nation of India get started here. He goes, but I'm going to hell. I know I am. And Gandhi says, why? He goes, because In the heat of battle, I grabbed a 4-year-old child and just bashed it against the wall and killed it mercilessly. You know, I can't be forgiven for that. There's a fascinating answer from that. How many of you have seen the movie, know the scene I'm talking about here? No, not too many. Okay. I strongly recommend you look it up on Netflix or rent it or stream it or whatever, because this is such a powerful scene. He said, I know a way out of hell. What you need to do is to go find a child that was orphaned in the war, and you need to raise that child as a good Hindu. Remember, the guy is Muslim. Raise the child as a good Hindu, one who is loving, one who is very accepting of everybody, no matter what kind of religious background, whether they're Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, it didn't matter. But raise that child in a loving environment to not be the same religion as you. And he said, that is your way out of hell. I think you'll learn a heck of a lesson when you hear what Gandhi, in this case, is saying. If you can do that, then you have truly learned the lesson inside. It's not that you have to be, that you ever make up for what's going on back there until you can forgive yourself. And that's one way to be able to do it. Until we have the technology of today, I'm not sure we could totally understand what goes on when we incarnate into the earth. If these physical bodies are just temporary and the soul is eternal and the soul can't be destroyed, it lives forever no matter what we do, we don't really understand that with our three-dimensional mind. But what about on the internet? You see these war games that they have on the internet, and you get your little game controller and you go in there and you've got your gun and you're shooting monsters or stabbing or using your sword or whatever it takes. And the next thing you know, oh, I got killed. Oh, I'm back again, and now I'm going to start shooting them all up again. Is this any different than what's going on here in the earth? From it, you're sitting at home, your soul's sitting up there in heaven with his game controller as we're down here in these incarnated bodies, and he goes, well, you should go left or you should go right or do this or do that. If you understand what's going on there, if you wind up doing something in that virtual world, yes, you are responsible for that, but it doesn't do permanent damage to the soul. So if you follow that virtual reality analogy right there, you said, when you took that kid and you did that horrible stuff to it, you said, it is absolutely horrible, but it is not the end of that child. That soul lives on and is an unconditionally loved child of God just as you are. And that doesn't change throughout eternity, no matter what you do. It's kind of a hard concept to get in touch with, especially if you're the one who had done that. But Gandhi has a good handle on how to get over it. Those who face the dark night of the soul know a truth that others may never understand as they reach a level of wisdom that offers true healing and peace. You remember that Paul wrote about Jesus and said, though he were a God, he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. If you are a God, if you are the Son of God, if you are, in fact, that same Philippians 2:5 talks about that it was not ego to think that he was equal with God. That's what it was, when you're taking that entire Bible quote. So if you're saying he had all the capabilities that God has in the universe, and you go, he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. How are you omniscient and you learn something? Anyone want to explain that one to me? How do you learn something when you know everything? This is a fascinating concept. But to me, if you just take a circle right here and you say, this is the totality of everything that we are and live and move and have our very being in the mind of God. Now let's say we go build Disneyland. All right, so when the Disneyland, we build it, here's the totality of everything we have. We've built this wonderful thing called Disneyland, and that goes out farther than what we had in the totality of God. Well, the circle just gets bigger to include that. And then we build something else that's even bigger and better, and boy, it gets bigger and bigger. Now that circle never stops being able to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think what that Bible verse is saying is that learning obedience just means that if this is the parameter of as much obedience as had ever been demonstrated up to that point, Jesus, in learning obedience, actually pushed those boundaries out even further by being obedient beyond what anybody had done before that time. Remember, he was in the Garden of Gethsemane and said, I'd like to let this cup pass. If there's any way I can get around this, I'd sure like to do it. Nevertheless, thy will be done. He goes, no other options? Okay, let's do it. And he went right on through it and finally was able to say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I don't know how many people in this room could go through what he did and have that as being your honest-to-God answer to them nailing you up on a cross. But that's pretty incredible in my book. And so now you figure it out and say, yep, that's what the Son of God would do. Now, the interesting thing in terms of, the level of wisdom that is offered when we come through our healing and get into peace with our dark night of the soul is that I like to go back to before the beginning, if we can speak of eternity as, in a sequential manner for a moment, and say, okay, before the beginning, and God is thinking about creating, as Cayce says, we are companions and co-creators with God. Companions and co-creators is why God created us. Now, did God need to have companions and co-creators? It's kind of like saying, do we need to add salt to our food? You can eat your food, be nourished by it, even enjoy it without having salt. But sometimes you add a little salt and you go, man, that's better. Remember that Bacos commercial way back when? You go, nice salad. You add Bacos and go, wow, even better. Well, here we are. Companions and co-creators made it better in God's experience. I mean, it isn't that God wasn't complete without having free-willed souls out there, but we made it even better. He also understood that if you're going to create a free-will soul, some of us are going to go astray, because that's what the nature of free will is. We are going to go astray if we have the ability to do so. But instead of seeing ourselves as the black sheep of the family, maybe we need to be able to start looking at ourselves as God does. And I think it's right here. God is looking at it going, you are my companions and my co-creators. And there are those of you who have gone through the dark night of the soul, and you're coming through that with a level of wisdom that offers true healing and peace. If you remember, in the parable of the prodigal son, there were two sons. Do you remember that? There were two sons there, and one of them is the one that went off and really took, his share and went off and spent it all off. Finally came back and said, I'm not living any better than the pigs are out here. I should go home and be a servant. And of course, he had his robe and his ring, and they had killed the fatted calf. And the other son's back there going, well, what the heck, man? I never messed up. Well, believe it or not, in the Cayce story, there are souls that have never messed up. They were the souls that stayed behind. But if you never tested yourself, if you just said, I'm going to sit right here and just be, and you're totally happy with just being, that have you really gone out there and exercised that, tested it, challenged it, been able to put yourself out there to see if you are the things that you profess to believe in. And it's not that one soul is more beloved than another, but it is that those of us who have gone astray like that, we're the one that he left the other 99 to come back and bring into the fold. And for everything that we have suffered, we learned obedience. And we reach a new level of wisdom that offers true healing and peace. And guess what? In the Cayce readings, it also talks about one of the things that is available to us after we have been able to overcome everything as Jesus did, is Jesus isn't unique in that he became the Savior to us here on earth. We have the choice, if we want, to be able to go out and find places of entrapment throughout the universes and to be as a Savior to them. I think we have an AA program going on for entrapped souls throughout the universes. Says if you choose to be an AA mentor here on earth, you may choose to be a selfishness mentor in the places of entrapment throughout the universes. That's quite a promise to keep up with. So God does, it's almost like we are admired for being the people who went out there, messed up, overcome the tremendous challenges, even though those challenges are self-created. It's quite a destiny for us all. The greatest thing in life is finding someone who knows all your mistakes and differences and still finds you absolutely amazing. May I suggest that that is God? We already have that with God, and I strongly suggest that we not take that for granted. It's very easy to take that for granted, but if more than 30% of us think that we have committed the unforgivable sin, and God still thinks that we are absolutely amazing despite all of that, that's really a pretty incredible thing. But it's always a wonderful thing for me when I see a couple that's obviously been together for 50 or more years, walking along, holding hands, and they still like each other after all that time, and you know they know everything there is to know about each other. My goodness, that is where you really start to understand how you can love God and love your neighbor as yourself, when you can get to that level. So we have, this is again another 262 reading here from the A Search for God reading books that we do with the Cayce meetings that we have on the first and third Mondays of the month. Yet, with the settling of those alterations, there came good, and that opposite from good, and this is the opposite of good, is to know good. That's not N-O, K-N-O-W. I'm making sure because they can't read that at home yet. And that opposite from good, to know good, into the material manifestations. And man, through the will, makes for his development or retardment through that what he does about that he sees manifested in the material world. Now, it's interesting that the opposite of good here is described as to know good. Why? Why is knowing what good is the opposite of to do, or the action, the verb of being good, if you will? And the reason that I see that, and the way that it's described here, is that knowledge not lived is sin. You ever hear that statement before? It's like if we learn something and then we don't apply it in our lives, that winds up being sinful. I can tell you that I have had people ask me, well, shouldn't I just stop trying to study all of this stuff? Because if I learn something new and then I don't apply it in my life, for goodness sakes, now I'm increasing my sinfulness. All right, really? I mean, being raised as I have, that kind of a thing really just, it doesn't compute for me. But the thing that I really need to point out on this is that, according to the Edgar Cayce readings, we were created in God's perfect image. And if we were created in God's perfect image, that means that we have access to all of God's omniscient knowledge, all of His omnipotent power. If we have access to all of that, then that means that we already know this stuff. So anything that we're doing that's sinful right now is we have the knowledge, we're not living it, it's sinful, get over it. We are already there. There is no reason to try to make it worse and think that, oh, well, these are all things that I don't know. On a higher level, we are still omniscient. There is a part of us that has never left God. And that's for another talk out there, but there really is three aspects. The soul, or spirit, mind, and will are the three aspects of the soul. Well, the spirit is God, because we wind up being that little piece of Him that He used and gave us our individual free will. So part of us is always going to be one with God, always have access to that omniscience and omnipotence. So the way to stop being selfish is for us to go forth and sin no more. Now, that sounds, or it's a lot easier said than done, but how do you wind up being able to do something like that? It's, in the Cayce readings, is described as line upon line, precept upon precept. Here a little, there a little, and so on. So it's layers of an onion that get peeled off. We keep looking for these giant leaps forward, and we don't do it that way. We just do it one step at a time. I reminded, talking about the Purriers a lot tonight, Ann Purrier, Herb Purrier's wife, had an incredible experience with her 15-year-old son who hung himself, committed suicide when he was 15 years old. And because she had psychic ability, like the mediums that are able to, talk to people who have passed on the other side, she was able to have her own conversations with her deceased son. And she was, having a conversation after he had killed himself, more than a year afterward, by the way. And so she had calmed down, he had calmed down, and she was discussing, his stepfather, her husband at the time, had just been awful to him. And you're no good, you're not measuring up, and, you know, you need to do better and you're just not worthwhile. And so he's taking all these negative feelings, and it was no help in causing him or encouraging him to not commit suicide. He had his own problems that he was going to commit suicide, just left to his own devices. But the father didn't help him. But Anne was having this conversation with him, saying, but if only he would have been more encouraging. And she goes, no, 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 you don't understand. This is not the first time he and I have been together. We have dealt with each other in previous lifetimes repeatedly. And guess what? Back in the earlier lifetimes, before we made all the progress that got us to where we are now, where he was just mentally abusive, he used to kill me, so I didn't have to kill myself. Now there, it sounds like that's like, you know, gallows humor or something, but it really was a true statement from Stephen to his mother Anne at that point, saying, you think he was being awful right here, but I can't tell you how much improvement there was to be able to get to the point where we are right now. So when I'm talking about this layers of an onion, and as it says here a little, there a little in the reading, so we just do it line upon line, we barely make progress in so many cases to be able to get to where we are today. And the readings say that when souls came into the earth, it has been millions or thousands and even millions of years. In fact, one of the readings talks about a soul that could go into caves in this New Mexico, Arizona area, and if they went into the right cave, would see drawings that they put there themselves 10 million years ago. Now, that does not mean that there were human beings walking the earth 10 million years ago. It just means that a soul came down into the earth, pushed themselves into matter much like we do now, but not necessarily in a human form, and said, I think I'll create some art on this cave wall. What the heck? Or maybe it was graffiti, I don't know. But that's going back as much as 10 million years is how long we've been here, and he says that it will still be hundreds and even thousands of years until we're all able to work our way off of this planet. The good news is that we're getting so close, relatively speaking, to the end days. But the end days, according to the Edgar Cayce readings, are thousands of years off instead of it being next week. So don't buy your Kool-Aid just yet. And here we have, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. This is from Psalms. The Lord is near the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Do we believe this? And the question is, if we do believe it, why do we believe it? And how did God let us get to the point where there is a dark night of the soul? That's what we really have to. I mean, how many times have you heard? In fact, I remember a friend of mine in the past that, you know, he was Jewish, and I said, you know, do you follow the Jewish laws? And he goes, well, I am Jewish, but I'm an atheist. I said, wow. And, what brought that about? And he goes, well, you know, my parents had gone through the concentration camps back in World War II, and with all of the stories that I've heard from them, he goes, I just can't believe that there's actually a God out there. So being Jewish is like being white or being black or being brown, or so, that it's more of an ethnicity than it is an actual religion to him. And so people don't believe that there is an unconditionally loving God who really is near the brokenhearted, who really is out there trying to help every single person whose spirit has been crushed. And so depending on where you wind up there, you can have day and night be when you're really out there giving it all you got and being of service and feeling the love, feeling the joy, and that the periods of darkness, if you want to call it that, is nothing more at night than when you are into recuperation or sleeping as opposed to some awful thing. And it could even be a period of growth, or it can be the dark night of the soul if you look at it like that. I'm reminded, I told you that my mother had been dealing with the Cayce readings for over 50 years by the time she passed away. And she wound up with a diagnosis of acute leukemia. And, you know, she was just feeling worn down, and she goes to the doctor, and they get several blood tests, and I remember being in there when he told her, he said, you've got 4 to 6 weeks to live. And that was it. Oh, well, you could go through all their chemotherapy, but that would kill you before then. So, yeah, 4 to 6 weeks to live. And she said, wow, well, that's tough news. She goes, but I've had a very good run. So they put her in hospice, And I don't, if you've been through the hospice or worked with a hospice program, they send their own, like we have chaplains here at Unity of Phoenix, they send chaplains from the hospice programs to be able to counsel with the people who are in the program. And so I happened to be over at my mother's house when they sent the hospice chaplain over to her, and I let them be. Got my mother out in the wheelchair, set her down on the couch, and the hospice lady's there, and she's getting ready to give her whole spiel. And so I went away and was doing something out in the garage, and I came back about 10 or 15 minutes. This woman, who's chaplain, has got her notebook out, and she's writing down everything my mother's telling her. So the woman who was going to go out there and be the consoler to the person that was going through the terminal situation of having acute cancer was getting lessons, in a perspective of what life and death and the day and night is for each one of us on the earth under that. Now, in the brackets, I put the brackets up here to be able to give context to what the reading is talking about here. There was a question about the passing shadow. Remember I said there'd be one later on about the passing shadow of Jesus as in a dream. So in other words, somebody's having a dream and they had a feeling that Jesus' shadow had crossed over them at that point. And the answer is, as one is passing, there may be a flash of a shadow from a plane, a cloud, a bird, or that which makes one more aware of the light, though one may itself be wholly in the light. Hence, as given, the thought, the intent of the mental mind of self at the experience was made aware of the master's passing by the shadow, as explained. See? So in this particular reading, what it was indicating in that dream is that the shadow of Jesus passing over them was simply drawing attention to the light that was constantly around them, and it was Jesus' shadow that was drawing attention to the light. So you'd have to think that Jesus having heaven on earth, experiencing heaven on earth, and I know people look at me like, Jesus, how could it be experiencing heaven on earth? This is not where the good stuff is. I beg to differ. This is a wonderful place to be. You just have to know how to live, as Jesus did. So he was absolutely ecstatic with his being here, with being able to be of service to us, to be the Savior of mankind, or humanity, not because it was an ego stroke for him, but because that was what he came here to do in the first place. And he was succeeding at a goal that he had started long ago on Arcturus that said, I want to come over there and be of service and to help my neighbor to be able to overcome what they've entrapped themselves in. So that brings up the question of what is the advantage to living on Earth, to be able to have this light, this light and darkness, day and night. Is there an advantage to why we are here on Earth? Why is it that we're here and not somewhere else? I've always thought when you think about it, going, hey, people are raised in some really bad environments, and that causes them to not be the best people that they could possibly be. What if you were to just take this soul and you plop them right down in this higher level of being, of existence, and they have all these great role models around, and there's nobody that, then you don't get to go hang out with the wrong crowd or element, and wouldn't they do better, if that were the experience? Why doesn't that work? Sounds like it would work, but why doesn't it work? It doesn't work because of where we are right now. Have you ever noticed that when people, if you want to call them ne'er-do-wells or whatever, birds of a feather flock together? Wherever you go, they're all going to find each other. It's almost like a magnet, that law of attraction, that all of those people that share that mindset tend to come together. Now, they may not treat each other very well, but they feel more comfortable hanging out with the people that are just as bad as they are than they do hanging out with the people that are full of light and love. They're going, oh, these people are a bunch of fuddy-duddies. They're no fun. I don't want to hang out with them. And the next thing you know, you start sinking to whatever the level is that you feel the most comfortable with. So what is it, once again, what is it about three dimensions that really is so good for us? I need you for a moment to just understand what it's like when we don't have these physical bodies. Before we became enmeshed in three dimensions in the earth, and we were souls, and we were not limited by time or space, think for a moment what that was like. But I'm going to start on a different tack. Think of here on Earth, if you wind up, let's say the first boyfriend or girlfriend you get with, and when something goes wrong there, you're out. So we break up, I go on. Then I get together with the next girl. That didn't work, you move on. And then you go to work at this job, and that boss is the son of a gun, and to heck with him, and I go get another job. Now, take away the physical body. And how much easier is it to keep running away from the problems that we have and encounter in this life if you don't have a physical body and responsibilities and contracts and families and all of that to have to take care of? If you're on the other side and you start to run into a problem within a group of people, you're out of there and you go to the next place. Until the problem comes up there. You're out of there and you go to the next place. And if you don't have all of these things that are kind of saying you need to slow down and hold on here and start working your way through this, because this is what we're here to do. We're here to learn how to play well with others. And the earth is an ideal way to be able to figure that out. Because why? Time is linear. We get to see cause and effect. If everything's happening to you all at once, how are you able to figure out that this thing over here is the cause and that's the effect when it's all happening to you at the same time? You don't know what cause and effect are attached to each other right there. On the earth, if you hit somebody and they hit you back, you pretty well got that cause and effect put together there. So linear time is very helpful. Physical bodies that die if you don't feed them, and it's a very uncomfortable way to die, tend to make you reminded of, I need to make sure I got food in my belly so I can't quit every job I want. We seem to want social contact. So I need to be friendly with other folks, at least to a certain level, to be able to, if you want friends, be friendly. If you want love in your life, be loving, and all of that. There is no better way to accomplish that in our soul growth than to be able to test it right here in 3 dimensions with linear time, with physical bodies, and the commitments that we make. We are forced to be able to get along or work things out with our neighbor just to be able to survive. The perspective that we get, Stephanie and I take care of a dear friend. In fact, I met her through the ARE when I was 8 or 9, and now she's in her late 80s and has dementia and Alzheimer's. And I take care of her. We go see her once a week at a senior care center, and there are about 7 little old ladies in there, and they're all in their 80s and 90s. And there's one named Grace, and she's a very traditional Christian in her thinking. She is absolutely convinced that when she dies, she's going to have the last judgment and go to heaven, and she can just barely see. I mean, she barely gets, light and darkness in what she's seeing out there. And I remember hearing, Stephanie was there too, hearing this. I remember her one time, she just said out loud, when I get to heaven, I'm going to turn on every light in the place. I'm like, wow. But you know what? You know what I really liked about that? I felt sorry that, she wasn't able to see, and there was obviously the limitation of that. But I liked that she thought she would be able to do that, and that it wouldn't be a sin, or it wouldn't be egotistical or selfish to want to go turn on every light in the place, and that it'd be okay. That mindset that said, I am finally worthy and I'm all right, I think was really counterintuitive to what she was like in her waking life here on earth. But at some level, she had that understanding of just what it was like to be perfect. This is such a true statement. When something bad happens, you have 3 choices. You can either let it define you, let it destroy you, or you can let it strengthen you. Some of you have heard this story, but it's so illustrative of how this works. I think I was 18 or 19 years old, and I really needed a job. And I had a friend of mine who was a general manager of a maintenance company. He goes, well, I can get you a job. He goes, there's this set of office buildings, and they need a day porter. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but at night they have maintenance crews that come in and clean the place up. But if things get messed up during the day, they have somebody that's on staff all the time in order to do that. Well, that was going to be me. I said, great. I was glad to have the job, had bills I needed to pay, neighbors to get along with, people to play better with. And so I go down there and I report to this supervisor. And the guy comes down, and I hadn't even met him yet, and he had just the worst attitude. He goes, So you think you're going to come down here and just be able to, slough off and do nothing? No, I came down here to work. And he goes, well, I'll tell you what, the last guy that was here, there was a mall nearby, and they had a two-way radio. Well, apparently the two-way radio worked just fine in the mall. And so he would leave the buildings altogether, go hang out in the mall and, play with the video games and talk to the girls or whatever at that time. And if he'd get a call, then he'd come back over. He goes, I'm not letting that happen anymore. And he came out and he had this plastic bucket and a brush, and he handed it to me. And he goes, you see these buildings right here? There were 4 of them. And they were all at least 12 stories each. And he goes, when you are not on a call cleaning something up, I want you with this bucket and this brush to scrub every square inch of every wall in the common areas. I'm like, what? And I'm not saying a word. I'm just sitting there. I take the bucket, and he says, you report it into me every couple of hours or whatever. And I'm like, okay. So he leaves, and there I am thinking, well, thank God I got a job to be able to pay the bills. And then I'm thinking, I'm scrubbing walls for the rest of it every single second that's going on. I'm just going to be hoping a toilet clogs. And what was really funny is that you can see this is reflecting. Imagine this sign right here is one of those office address things where it gives you a listing of all the tenants in there. And so the guy had just walked away, and I'm sitting here holding the bucket. I look up and I see my reflection. And my first appraisal of myself is, don't I look pathetic? Me and my bucket, my brush right here, getting ready to really do all this for minimum wage. And then I looked at something, and I looked beyond my own image. This is where it just becomes so metaphoric. I looked beyond my own image, and I was seeing the listing of all of the companies that were in that building. And I happened to be looking on the 7th floor where the Irvine Company, that was the name of the owner corporation of the property, biggest property owner in Southern California. So the Irvine Company's main offices for the president, executive CEO and all of that were on the 7th floor. I go, okay, what's good about this? How about if I take my bucket, my brush, and go up and I start on the 7th floor where I'm catching the attention of the right people? So I did. Spick and span, a little hot water, went up there. You wouldn't believe what was on the 7th floor. Their walls, I kid you not, had white Berber carpet on the walls. This is back when you were allowed to smoke in buildings. That's how old I am. Seemed like a long time ago, didn't it? And so you could really see it when I started scrubbing on the carpet. It comes out white, and all the rest of it, you can see that tobacco, staining yellow on the stuff there. Well, as I'm doing this, you can tell that all of the people are coming by and seeing the difference in there, and I am just doing everything I can to help these people. Okay, you need, UPS boxes just got dropped off, and copier paper and all that, and oh my gosh, the secretaries love me, for being over there and doing that. And by the end of the first week, this guy that had been such a son of a gun to me, he comes over and he goes, well, I've been told that you have to get a 50-cent raise per hour. And I said, wow, that's good news. And you could tell he didn't like that at all. But, and my problem is by the end of the second week, I had almost scrubbed all of that Berber carpet white. I'm going, uh-oh, I'm going to get out of sight, out of mind. He comes to give me my paycheck at the end of the week, and he goes, you're being promoted to being the supervisor that is going to clean this building. This is inside of 2 weeks, folks. It wasn't just a raise. It was a big raise in order to do that. And they put me in charge of the entire building when I'm about 19 years old, because those executives on that level said, this kid at 19 knows exactly how to be able to keep a building clean. I don't know what the heck you all have been doing up to now. But go back to where I was. I was pathetic with my bucket and my brush, looking at how awful I was in my reflection. And it wasn't until I looked past that and said, what's good about this? What can I do at this moment that not only is going to be an advantage to me, but is going to be an advantage to the other people around here as well? I can't tell you a better example of how to be able to take something that looked like not necessarily the dark night of the soul, but I didn't let it define me or destroy me. I let it strengthen me at the same time. 288 is the person asking this question. If you're not familiar with, this is the Search for God readings at 262. The GDT there stands for Gladys Davis Turner. This is the lady who was indeed the scribe and took down all of the Cayce readings. So she's asking this question. Is it true that day and night are condensed or miniature copies of incarnations into the earth and into planetary or spiritual sojourns? They, in turn, being miniature copies of what took place in the beginning. The beginning with a capital B means the original fall. You know, when Cayce says that we were rebellious and made selfish choices when we were all one with God. The A here is the answer to the question. Very good. If you understood just what all of this means. It's a very good illustration of that which has just been given as to how there is the evolution of the soul, evolution of the mind, but not evolution of matter, saved through mind and that which builds same. So what's being clarified here is the Cayce readings are coming back and saying, as above, so below. On earth as it is in heaven is the opposite of that, if you remember that from the Lord's Prayer. As above, so below. And what he's making clear is that we are going through, in this macrocosm, if you will, of the original rebelliousness through selfishness. We went ahead and started making our own decisions, our own choices that were not in accord with God's will, was what the fall was. And every time we wind up coming into this day and night, we are trying to figure out whether we're in this light and recuperation or whether we're going into the dark night of the soul just by the choices that we wind up making. So every time we have a fall from heaven to the next level, and this is something my wife and I were discussing the other night that I want to try to make clear here. And that is, a lot of people think that the fall, and Cayce says that we wound up being selfish or rebellious against God's loving ways before there was a manifest universe. I know that's hard for us three-dimensional beings to think of, but we were disobedient to God even before he said, let there be light. So we sang with the morning stars, if you've ever heard that statement, of which we were around before any of the universe was created, and we were already rebellious or selfish at that point. Now, the one thing I'm trying to make clear here is that people think we were rebellious and God threw us down here on earth like we're in timeout or in jail or in prison or something like that. I would like to suggest that this may be the 25th or the 2,500th place that we've ended up. Remember when I said, I'm out of here. This went wrong. I'm out of here. We kept going to the next place and screwing up in the next place because we weren't limited by time or space in the physical body. The earth has really been much more of a safety net to be able to catch us. It was almost like, the fishing nets just drag through the sea and get all the fish along in there. Imagine that the earth is just so compelling that it takes all the souls who are, kind of going their own way, and they go, gosh, that looks great. I'm going to go try that out. And the next thing you know, you're caught up in the net over here that allows you to be able to start getting on your way back to God. And so through our own free will, we eventually choose to come to earth. We didn't come straight here. It took us a number of iterations throughout the universe and all the levels and planes of existence and dimensions to be able to get here, but eventually we wound up being here. And this is a microcosm. Our disobedience that got us here is a microcosm of the original choices in which we chose to go against the will of God. And of course, again, this is all about the parable of the prodigal son, in which we went our own way and we're finally turning around and trying to meet God back on the road to his house. And so in physical self, there may be the illustration of day and night. Each element, each corpuscle of the body is a universe in itself, or a universe on the beginning of power and force. This is so important. A universe on the beginning of power and force, saying that a universe is being created based on power and force, not on love. This is a universe being corrected out of balance with what God would have us do. When there is that called disease, there becomes the unawareness of the darkness, of the light that may become life in its manifested form. So when you look at this, it's saying that when we make poor choices and we are not aware and we're in a human body, each corpuscle of the body is the universe itself. Does anybody remember going to Disneyland several decades ago and seen a ride called the Inner Space by Monsanto? You get in these little half-shell things, and you go riding through there, and it would show you that you were going into a snowflake, that you were being shrunk down into a snowflake. And the interesting thing about it is at first the snowflakes just look like they're gigantic, and then as you keep getting smaller and smaller, you get to see that what an atom looks like on the outside, then you're in the inside of the atom and it's springing all around, and then you get smaller yet, and the next thing you know, you look up and you see it looks like you're in space in the Milky Way, and yet you are inside of an atom. If you've never been on that, it's not there anymore. It's now Star Tours. But that particular ride was always fascinating to me, showing that we have this huge galaxy and galaxies beyond that are looked to, as we look up into the night sky, which is actually duplicated or a microcosm of that inside of the atom. So when it's talking about that each corpuscle of the body is a universe in itself that's based on power and force, this is dis-ease. This is us making choices out of accord with the unconditionally loving ways of God. There's a statement that Cayce makes that fascinates me. He said, if you will take 3 plain almonds every day, the body will not be tempted toward cancer. It's not a cure, it is preventative. You needed to have been doing this all along. The body will not be tempted toward cancer. In other words, our body, our cells that it's talking about here, as we have thoughts that are not in accord with that which are God, which are based on power and force, you wind up creating a universe within each one of those corpuscles that's out of alignment and therefore gets tempted toward cancer or disease. And so what we need to do is to go through there and heal the body to bring it back into harmony with God's loving ways, and then the diseased universe, corpuscles, disease goes away. As we heal ourselves, then those things go away. Because one of the things Cayce made clear is that only things of God are eternal, things that are loving. Our perfect bodies can last as long as we need them to if we treated them right. If we didn't have negative thoughts, and if our assimilations matched our eliminations, we could live for as long as we wanted to. And so that's but anything that has a beginning will also have an end. So since God didn't create us as anything but perfect, all of our unloving and negative choices, our selfishness, all had a beginning, and it too will wind up having an end. It's just the way that it was created. So God stacked the deck in our favor. There's no doubt that we have things working for us. So you come down to, there are no dark nights of the soul. There are only dark nights of the ego. When we wind up recognizing that it's the part of us that is that gets afraid because we are separated from God, once we recognize how much there is a oneness, not only with God, but with each and every one of us, that there is no dark night of the soul. And in fact, how can you have a dark night of the soul when everybody is pushing together and pulling together like that as one? And so there we are. Questions at this point? Or did I just cover the dark night of the soul so well that you couldn't possibly wonder any one thing? As you can see on here, you have a email address to be able to contact me. If you would like a copy of this PowerPoint or the original Cayce readings, I am able to send those to you as an attachment, a Adobe PDF attachment. So it's just my name backwards, schroederjohn@cox.net. And if you can't remember that, if you can remember the name Edgar Cayce AZ for Arizona.org, you can go there, and not only will you see how to be able to contact me or us, you will also be able to see this recording in another week or two when it's edited down and put up on YouTube.